Okay, so this class, friends, is also in connection with the 20th of Av, which is tonight and tomorrow. And the 20th of Av is the Yortzeit of the Rebbe's father, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Schneerson. And this will be 75 years since he passed away, or we should say actually perished, or not in the concentration camp. He had been arrested by the Soviet authorities. He was a mortal enemy of the state, counter-revolutionary, a leader of the Lubavitch underground. His Mechoten, that's the previous Rebbe, of course, was the enemy number one. And Rabbi Levi was way up there. So this is 75 years since he passed away. He was arrested, interrogated, and exiled to a place called Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan, where eventually his wife, the Rebbe Sanchana, was able to find him and spend the last months with him, succumbed to deprivation, hunger, and passed away in his early 60s. On this day, tonight and tomorrow, 75 years ago. So today's teaching is going to incorporate one of his teachings. He was a preeminent Kabbalist. And interesting story is that when the Rebbe Sanchana found him, through exhaustive search and persistence, and eventually the Soviet authorities relented and told her where he was. So she was able to bring with a small amount of books. Amongst them, there was a Chumash, a set of Chumash, and the Zohar. So we had no pen and paper, only these scant books, but she was able to fashion a quill from reeds and ink from herbs in the field, and he wrote his notes on the margin of these books. In 1945-46, when the Russian government allowed Polish refugees to return to Poland. So that was an extraordinary window of opportunity for people to leave Russia. My mother and my grandparents left that way on false Polish passports, as did all of the Lubavitchers who were able to get out. It was a great risk, mostly for the people who were making the passports and the people that were using them. That's pretty much an untold story. As you just mentioned it last week, one of the heroes of that era, his name was Leib Kemochkin, very famous Montreal name because his brother lives here, who was the head of Chabad of Montreal, under which this Chabad house is one of the 35 Chabad houses under his jurisdiction. His father, the Peretz Mochkin, anybody who knows Jewish Montreal, Torah Montreal, he was a revered figure. So this is a brother of the current battle, son of the Peretz. So he just passed away at the age of 95 on Tisha B'Av in New York. He is a young man in Russia, was very involved in procuring and creating these false passports. He was really a modern day hero. He was a ostensible member of the KGB, had tremendous connections there, was able to shut mouths in more ways than one and allow Jews to escape. So he just passed away, and many people owe their freedom, of course, to God, but he was the agent for their freedom. Others were caught in the process and didn't make it out, exiled, banished to Siberia, and some were faced a more harsher judgment. At any rate, so back to the notes of Rabbi Levi. So the Rebbe Sanchana, after whom many Chabad girls, including my daughter, are named, Levi Yitzchak. Levi is named after her husband, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak. So she, after he passed away, and this is in 44 and 45, is when after the war, they're able to get out of Russia through Lemberg. She took these books that he'd written, these notes on the margin. Now that was tremendous risk. It would give away the fact that she was Russian. Moreover, she was a Schneersohn. How did she get his books? So that meant facing severe consequences. She risked her life nonetheless and brought these books out with her. They were subsequently published, and they comprise some 5 volumes. And it was the Rebbe's custom for many years to devote one of his talks at the Shabbos gatherings to one of his father's commentaries. And he would always point out that the commentaries were written on the margins of a book, so very brief, very seminally, and there were many questions his father did not address, assuming that the astute reader would understand. But the Rebbe would explain it for us. And so there's a whole library of the Rebbe's commentary on his father's cryptic notes written on the margins of his books. I will share with you today something of that. As you'll see, it's very relevant to the time in the calendar where we are right now, just coming from Tisha B'Av, the 15th of Av, and days away from Elul, leading to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. All right, let's begin our journey. Because of time restraints, we'll have to keep it less complex than we would have liked it to be, because the beauty is in the nuance and the details, of course. Nonetheless, you shall find it, no doubt, rewarding. Again, you're going to have to exercise discipline and only read what I tell you to read. Otherwise, it will be an exercise in futility for you. We want to spare you that.
Is it translated to English?
Yes.
Is what translated?
Yes. The cryptic notes.
No, they cannot be translated. They're highly Kabbalistic.
Yes.
But there is one book that came out recently, written by a young man who's a shliach in Texas, some town in Texas. I'll tell you his name in a moment. Anyway, he wrote a beautiful book about, so thick, and it's I think maybe 10 essays or so in English on some of the commentary of Rabbi Levi and the Rebbe's elucidation. Let me just tell you, that entire book in English would make up maybe one column of commentary, maybe, of one page. The book this thick. That tells you how much background you need to know to understand this commentary. It's a commentary on the Zohar, which itself is a commentary on the Chumash, and your Kabbalistic and Talmudic background. He did the great good fortune for us of setting it all forth to any reader without any background, pretty much. It's a wonderful book. I forgot the name of it. It just came out, but that's the answer to your question.
The original commentary in Yiddish or
Not in Aramaic and Hebrew.
Oh, Aramaic.
Hebrew and Aramaic.
You think you could remember it for next time?
When you leave, I'll look it up. Before you leave, I'll look it up on the internet. I'll tell. I'm embarrassed for the listeners who are listening to this that I've forgot the name of the book. And his name is Block. That's the author of the book. Perhaps Mendy. I forgot his first name. Excuse me if I got your name wrong. We shall correct it to the next year. All right. So God willing, we'll tell you the name of the book. You can order it online from the Chabad Lubavitch Printing House in New York. Let's begin our journey. I think we're going to let's start. See how we go. So the top of your page is a quote from the Rambam, Maimonides, Hilchos Beis Abchir, the laws of God's chosen house. How apropos again, we're just coming from Tisha B'Av, where the house is destroyed. By studying the laws, we are building it. So this is law number 9 of chapter 1. I'll read it in English. The law is, Maimonides is talking about what materials you can use to build the temple, and he says you must not build with any wood protruding at all, only stone, bricks, or cement. Similarly, you must not make wooden chambers in the courtyard. Rather, they were made of stones or a brick. So these are chambers that are not part of the actual. They're part of they are part of the complex. They're part of the temple complex, but they're chambers for various functions. They too, since they're part of the complex in general, likewise the same rules apply that he just stated. Clear? Now the finer print there, let's read it together. The Ravid, listen up before you read further. The Ravid, Rabbi Avram, listen up. Rabbi Avram ben David was a colleague of the Rambam and wrote a gloss printed in every standard edition of the Rambam where he critiques or argues with the Rambam in many points of law. Here's case in point. He argues. What's the argument? The Ravid objects to this halacha. What halacha? What did the halacha just say? In summary? No wood. That's the bottom line. So he says there was, noting that there were wooden structures on the Temple Mount. Two of them. Number one, the high priest's chamber was wood. Don't read further, please. Listen up so I can explain to you what we just read. I'll show you on a map in a moment that there was a chamber or a suite allocated for the Kohen Gadol, for the high priest. It was used for 7 days out of the year. From after Rosh Hashanah till after Yom Kippur, it's exactly 7 days. He was there, in other words, for a week, actually longer, 8 days. 7 days plus Yom Kippur. So for a week before Yom Kippur, he was there in this suite. He did not leave the Temple Mount, basically to avoid possible contraction of impurity, of which there are many defiling agents, as much as possible to avoid that. Also, he had to separate from family life. Also, he had to be and was instructed in the very complex and detailed service he was going to do on Yom Kippur. So there's a special suite that was dedicated to the Kohen Gadol, where he was for the week before Yom Kippur and on Yom Kippur. Now that was made of wood. It was called the Lishkat Ha'etz, the chamber of wood. So the Ravid says, how does the Rambam say you cannot build with wood? There was wood. Let me just show you where it was. You'll see it together with all the viewers. I'm not going to go through all the details of this map because we have many times, but it's right there. That's the suite of the Kohen Gadol, that rectangular box. This is the altar. This is the Heichal, the sanctuary. This is the entrance hall. This is the holy. This is the Holy of Holies. The western wall is behind here. All right? So that was made of wood. Furthermore, he objects. In addition, wooden balconies were built in the women's courtyard on Sukkot to allow the people to observe the Simchat Bet HaSheva celebrations, which we won't go into explaining now, but we have in the past. Bottom line is, they would build balconies made of wood in the women's courtyard, and this is the women's courtyard, this whole area here. This is the origin, by the way, of separating men and women, and also the origin of women being in a balcony, an upper floor. This is the origin. The big celebrations on Sukkot, men and women were separated. So that's his objection. Now, before you go further, listen up again. We need some background information. Yes?
I'm just wondering, was that the only time they were separated, or they were separated?
In those days, yes. Yeah. Then because, whole digression, but it didn't have synagogues like we have today. Altogether, the temple was the one place of worship. At any rate, but that's the origin of it. And as generations declined, the need for further borders and boundaries become necessary. You need borders and boundaries to protect everybody. When there's no need to protect, less need for borders. Most of our lives, friends, are about our borders. business is 90% about protecting and 10% about making the profit. 90% is protecting the profit from somebody who would take advantage. If you think about how much we do to protect, unfortunately, there's also the upshot of that, most of our preoccupation. So in a more ethereal and spiritual world, there's less need for borders, much more unity and openness. When Mashiach will come, Jerusalem will not have to be walled. All of the walled cities, there will be no need for them. Prazot, it's a famous song. Prazot Teshev Yerushalayim, is Jerusalem will be open. The whole world will live in unity and harmony. Back to our discussion. So don't read further because you need to know the following information. Otherwise nothing will make any sense. I'm going to go back to the beginning of this whole law. Why can't you build with wood? What's wrong with wood? Since when do we discriminate against using wood? Of course we don't. The issue here at hand is this. The Torah says, this is in scripture, not to plant, God says, do not plant an asherah tree, it's a kind of tree, near my altar, because the Canaanites worshipped it. Obvious, so it's an object of worship, nowhere near my altar. That's scriptural law. The sages, like they always do, expand the law in order to protect it. They said, no wood at all. Like, that's typical. For example, on Shabbos you may not strike a match and make a fire. The sages say we don't touch matches. And there are thousands of such examples of rabbinic law that protect scriptural law, case in point. That's the reason for this. No wood on the temple, in the temple structure. Now back to the Ravid's objection. The Ravid says, what do you mean you can't build it anywhere? They did. I just showed you where, 2 examples. Therefore he concludes, he argues with the Rambam. The Rambam says you cannot use it, wood anywhere. Look at his answer. His answer is, thus he concludes, who's the he? The Ravid, Rabbi Avram ben David, that the prohibition against building with any protruding wood applies only within the area set off for the priests within the temple courtyard and not elsewhere in the Temple Mount. Only that region can be described as, what Scripture, Deuteronomy 16:21, near the altar of God. So this is his position. The Ravid says like this. Look, you see why it's okay to build? Because it's outside. This is the temple courtyard. It's out. It's not in the temple courtyard. Therefore, it's permissible. Good. So the Ravid has his position, but the Rambam holds differently. He holds that the prohibition applies everywhere. So we have to explain the Rambam. It's a good question. How do they build? How do you say that you cannot have wood anywhere? The Kohen Gadol, the high priest's chamber, was in fact made of wood. And the second objection, on Sukkot, they built these wooden balconies. The second objection is fairly easy to dispose of. Now I'm going to kind of lead you to, and I want you to tell me how to defend the Rambam against the second objection about the women's balconies. That presents no problem. The balconies were only put up on Sukkot. So what's your answer? They're temporary. The sages only prohibited using wood, which itself is protecting, expanding scriptural law, when you're using wood as part of the structure itself. But for the 7 days of Sukkot, as a temporary measure to facilitate the great numbers of people and separate men and women, that to begin with doesn't fall under the prohibition. So that objection is easily dismissed. But what about his question of the chamber of the Kohen Gadol? The answer is, if we look very carefully at the wording of the Rambam, let's reread the words. We must not build with any wood protruding. But what if the wood is covered? No problem. So indeed, the high priest's chamber was made of wood, but it wasn't exposed. It was covered. It was covered by cement or plaster or what have you. So that is the answer to the Ravid's objections. Yes?
what was the point of building it with wood in the first place if it was going to be covered?
And that's going to be my next question.
Okay.
That's the Rebbe's question. Why, in the first place, build it with wood then, and then avoiding the or respecting the prohibition of the sages not to have wood protruding, cover it, make it like beautiful Jerusalem stone, like everything else in the temple, and as the expression goes, Shalom al Yisrael, peace unto all Jews. The Rambam and the Rebbe don't have to argue. So the answer is as follows. We'll begin our journey in the answer. And here's where we are going to quote from the Rebbe's father. So listen up for a moment, then we'll direct your attention to the appropriate text. The Rebbe's father notes that the tree is a symbol of longevity. Fact, the tree is the longest living organism in the world. Oldest living thing is a tree. Nothing lives longer than a tree. The oldest creature, I think, is the tortoise. Elephants live to old age. But in terms of a living plant life, the oldest is a tree. Now, parenthetically, this is fascinating to note. You probably know where the oldest trees in the world are located. California. The redwood trees, the redwood trees of California are the largest because they are the oldest living tree. They're the oldest living entity in the world, as far as we know, in the universe. And they are beautiful. Pardon?
Not the olive trees.
No, olive trees don't live anywhere near that age. I'll soon tell you how old these trees are. Now, up until a lot of them, when it was the late 20s or 30s, the U.S. government has forbidden, I think entirely, to use these trees for lumber. But at one time they were used for lumber, and they have now declared the redwood trees and many other natural places in the U.S. as there's a term for them. They're protected. They are, shrines, as it were. But up until recently, they were felled for timber. In fact, till today, if you visit there, some of the trees, incredibly, have these huge carved out arches that lorries, trucks drive through. That's how enormous they are. Here's the amazing thing. Everybody knows that every year a tree, every year adds a ring. If you've got a tree, you get the physical rings. So guess how many rings there are here? Around 6,000, not more. Pointing to the age of the world according to the Torah. This is hardcore evidence. The word is empirical evidence. Empirical evidence of the age of the world. Here is the oldest living thing in the world, and it's 6,000 years, not older. I don't want to go into the subject of the age of the world because that's science and Judaism subject, but just to point out that there are theories about the age of the world and universe, and it's all based, most of them, on carbon dating, which makes all kinds of huge assumptions, including that the amount of radioactivity intensity in the universe has been constant. So based on that, things are deemed to be as old as they appear to be. But what if, at the beginning or at some point, there was a tremendous amount of radioactivity, and Torah says there was initial creation was this intense explosion of energy, then the whole carbon dating is off, or the whole dating is off, and be off by hundreds of millions of years possibly. So the only empirical, we know, every year it adds a ring, although no reason to say that it may be hastened. So maybe the world is younger, or maybe it's slowed. So the maybes do exist, but in terms of at least our own observation, every year it adds a ring. Bingo! The oldest living thing is exactly as old as the Torah says. Close brackets, back to our discussion. So the tree is the symbol of longevity. I want to refer your attention to this quote at the bottom of the page. This is a prophecy by Isaiah God is speaking through the prophet. God tells the prophet to tell the people when Mashiach will come, they shall not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For as the days of a tree shall the days of my people be. And my chosen ones shall long enjoy the work of their hands. So scripture, the prophet himself employs what? The tree as the symbol of long life. And therefore we want the high priest's chamber. Listen up, friends. Don't read, not on your text. We want the high priest's chamber to be made of wood because he's the symbol of long life. Why is he the symbol of long life? Number one, Kohanim in general embody the attribute of chesed. Leviim embody the attribute of gevura. Not to be explained now, but that is the fact. Chesed, benevolence, kindness, bestowal, long life. If I were to ask you, the Kohen Gadol friends, the high priest, the focal point of the entire people on Yom Kippur, he went into the Holy of Holies in Yom Kippur. We'll soon talk about the Holy of Holies. What's the first thing he's praying for? What's the first thing we ask for? Not a mystery. What do you ask for the first thing from God? Health, a long life. Yom Kippur is sealed and written for what? The book of life. This whole chamber is all in preparation for what? For him going into the Holy of Holies in Yom Kippur. And what we want him to elicit on behalf of us all is long life. So we want this chamber to be made out of wood because it's symbolic of exactly what it is that he is there to elicit and achieve. Moreover, explains Rabbi Levi, we see the connection between the high priest and long life. We read about it a couple weeks ago in the Parsha. Maybe somebody can remember. I'll try and lead you to this. The law of the manslaughterer. What's the law of the inadvertent killer? He killed by mistake. So what's the law?
He's there until he dies.
The next of kin has the right, some say the obligation, to avenge the blood of their fallen relative. So what happens? There are 48 cities throughout the length and breadth of the land of Israel, cities of refuge. These were the Levitical cities where the Levites lived. They were yeshiva towns all over the country, points of spiritual inspiration. That's where he would go and be protected. And he remained there until the high priest died. What's the connection? Then he goes free and the family can't touch him. Why is he there to the what does one have to do together? First of all, what does have to go there all together? It's a separate discussion. That's because there's no accidents. If someone loses a life through my hand, I've got some inner introspection and cleansing to do. I got to go to a Levitical town to discover how this could happen through me, because there are no accidents. I may have had a murderous thought once, and who didn't? Who didn't even say I could kill you, or even think it? Of course, I would never do it, but I think it. Bad enough. So he goes there to achieve atonement. For how long? Until the high priest dies. And what's the connection? So Rashi, basic commentary on the Chumash, because it's right there. This is a scriptural commandment. Rashi says, you shorten the life of man. It's of somebody. It's unfitting you should share the same space, as it were, with the high priest, whose whole identity is to prolong the life of man. So in his death, that's when your atonement is complete. So what do we see from here? We see very powerfully the association between the Kohen Gadol and long life. So that's the reason that we want the chamber to be of wood. It's got to be covered, because not to violate the rabbinic law, based on the Torah law, that there be no protruding wood, according to the Rambam, and that applies everywhere in the complex, including the complex of the high priest. I'm waiting for your question. It's a subtle kind of question, a penetrating kind of question. The Rebbe says, but wait a second. If it's a good thing to be made out of wood, because it's a symbol of longevity, this beautiful verse embodied by the Kohen Gadol, who he is and what he has to achieve, he embodies kindness and blessing in long life and health, then why should not God give the law in the first place that states the whole building complex you build out of what? Jerusalem stone. But this one, because it's the high priest chamber, that should be the exception. There's plenty of exceptions in Jewish law. Why isn't this one? So it's a very simple question. Why isn't the law in the first place? This is the exception, and you build it of exposed wood, because here the virtue of it represents long life. Again, there are many exceptions in Jewish law. On Shabbos you have to eat and feast. Before Yom Kippur you don't. I mean, it's hundreds of exceptions. On Shabbos it's forbidden to cook, make a fire. But they brought the offerings in the temple. The temple is an exception. So it's not uncommon. I mean, in fact, all laws are somehow an exception to some other rule. So why not here? We must say perforce, and this is where we really get into the subject, that on the one hand we want the long life. It should be made of the chamber of wood, but it's got to be covered. And not simply to respect some other unrelated law, but it's integral to the Kohen Gadol and who he is and what happens on Yom Kippur. Somehow it's all symbolized in this paradox of it's present but it's covered. We shall begin our journey now, and we'll have to finish it next week because I want to do justice to it, but you will leave nonetheless already with a beautiful insight. So I want you to know, this is not on your text anywhere, as follows. Rabbi Levi explains this too. What does he explain? Strange thing. This chamber is referred to in the Mishnah, which is the basic text of Jewish law, in several places. Here's two of them. One in Tractate Midot. Now, Midot means measures. There's a whole tractate devoted to the specific, precise dimensions of the Second Temple, one that Herod refurbished. Details. The laws, Maimonides' laws, are based largely on that tractate. So there's a reference to this chamber. It tells us exactly where it is. I showed you on the map, and what was used for, and its dimensions. And it's called the Lishkat Ha'etz, the chamber of wood. But then, when we study Tractate Yuma means day. It means the day. What's the day of the year? Yom Kippur. So there in Tractate Yuma, there's also a reference to the high priest, as I just told you, moving into this chamber a week before Yom Kippur. All of a sudden, it's got a new name, Parhedrin. What happened? It was called the Chamber of the Wood. That's called Parhedrin.
What is Parhedrin?
I'm going to tell you. Now, Parhedrin means, the Talmud explains this, the Talmud notes this name change. Why? It's a Greek word. And it means king's officer. Why is this called king's officer? On the surface, the reason is, we're going to go a lot deeper next week, but on the surface, it's a sad commentary on the reality of the day, which Rabbi Levi explains was towards the end of the Second Temple. And that is as follows. King's officer. Now the king would change his officers every 12 months. Presumably because you don't want people in power there too long, to get too comfortable in power and to preempt fomentation of not just corruption but rebellion, people getting too close. Every 12 months there's a turnover. So what's the commentary? The high priests towards the end of the Second Temple were not pious. The Romans controlled Jewish life. This is before they destroyed it. So towards the end already, there was a tight vice, a grip on Jewish life. Now, this is a whole story. They had no intention of destroying it, really. The destruction of the temple was provoked by Jews. Story for another time. Who provoked the Romans? The sages were bitterly opposed to that kind of extremism. They were called the zealots. Story for another time. But anyway, this is under Roman rule. So these high priests towards the end of the Second Temple under Roman rule bought their position. They weren't appointed as they should be by the Supreme High Court of Israel, but appointed by the Romans. Because many were not pious, this is what happened. If you're not pious, saintly, and you go into the Holy of Holies and you're impure, you either die then and there, or in the course of the year, you don't live the year out. And very often, every year was another Kohen Gadol, because the old one, the one previously had not survived the year. They used to go in, friends, with a chain attached to their ankle, because if he died in the Holy of Holies, nobody can go in and get him. Only a high priest can go in on Yom Kippur. He was dragged out. Now, because there was this turnover, this commentary, the high priests are like the king's officers. Every year, another change. Question?
Yeah. This, the room for the high priest.
The chamber, yeah.
Chamber.
The suite, yes.
Okay, in preparation of Yom Kippur. Wouldn't that serve to prevent the impurity or the reason for him to have to die?
Okay, I'll answer your question simply and then deeper in a few moments. The question raised was, he's for a whole week before an intensive preparation for his service in Yom Kippur. That's why he is ensconced in the temple complex and he lived in this suite. Wouldn't he have become purified then? So the answer is he would be impure from literal impurity. But his own state of mind, his own spiritual standing, he may have, but 1 week perhaps may not be enough. Although it can happen in a moment. It can happen in a moment. So they weren't all not pious, but many were. And again, they bought their position simply because they paid for it. So that's why it's called Pahedrin. So Rabbi Levi explains that only happened towards the end of the Second Temple, after Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Just, who served for decades as high priest in the temple. Then the big decline happened. That's towards the end period. Now the Rebbe asks like this. Why are we changing the name? Why are we enshrining this terrible descent of our spiritual standing? That the high priests were not holy and corrupt and they bought the position. Why do you want to enshrine that and make it a name of something in the temple? It's bad enough that they were. Do we have to make it like enshrine it official? That now there's a name change from the chamber of the wood or the wooden chamber to the Pahedrin chamber. Moreover, not every high priest, even towards the end of the Second Temple, was not pious. Some of them were tzaddikim. Why should the righteous high priest have to suffer the indignation of being in a chamber? It's called the king officer because there's a big turnover. And maybe to make the question stronger, as Peggy you suggest, even if he was till now, he bought it. But now he's there for a week and he's being submerged in the atmosphere of the holy temple, he may have done teshuvah. So are we going to assume that everybody is going to be not pious? Give him the benefit of the doubt. This is so un-Jewish. And moreover, make the question stronger. When is he living here? Which part of the year?
Before the 10th day?
Before Yom Kippur. So help me with the question now. Yom Kippur is a time where what? We want to invoke the merits of the Jewish people. We don't want to highlight failures. It's incongruous that he is in a chamber in preparation for Yom Kippur, and the chamber called Parhedrin is an allusion to the corruption of the high priests. We want to enshrine that. Any time is not a good thing, especially not now, when it's being not used year-end, it's only used for Yom Kippur. It seems so strange. Very strong questions. All one question. Inappropriate. The high priest may have been righteous, and many were, and served year after year. And you say, why are they have to be direct? Why are they staying in a room that invokes or means the opposite of righteousness? So the Rebbe suggests an answer, which is a beautiful answer in its own right. And next week we'll go deep. Here's the answer. Valid, but we're still going to go deep. The fact that there was a new high priest every year, often, even when it was, is actually a huge compliment to these people. Why? Because the Kohen Gadol that vied for this and paid for it. Now you know, Mr. Kohen Gadol, you know who you are. You know you're not more righteous than the one last year or 2 years ago. Why are you vying for this? There is a good chance you're not going to survive. They all knew this, but it was worth it to be one moment, it's only a few moments, in the Holy of Holies and experience the revelation of God in the most extraordinary way. That's a huge compliment. How many people would do that? They're paying money for what? To go into the Holy of Holies, knowing full well that he may not survive because he knows he's not a tzaddik, but it's worth it. So that's a compliment. So it's kind of a Parhedrin is a changeover, but the flip side of that is that's pretty amazing that these people are vying for it. Now just illustrate the point now. You want to say something?
Sorry.
No, sorry.
I was wondering, why would God proceed to reveal himself to a Kohen Gadol who is not righteous?
It was a place where he was revealed. God said, I've chosen this place.
And no matter what.
No, it's unconditional revelation. It's a place where my being, says God, is revealed. So, that's a kind of a compliment. You might want to say that. Now I just want to go to zero in on this a little bit, and the next week deeper, and share with you a beautiful insight by Rabbi Manis Friedman. He may have said it when he was here. He says as follows, he asked the following question. Our sages say it's not so much his piety overall. It gets even more specific. An impure thought in the Holy of Holies. That would be his undoing. The question is, it's all of 5 minutes. Can't control your thoughts? How saintly do you have to be? Anybody, you and I, going to the Holy of Holies in Yom Kippur, we're going to be focused on the moment at hand and not think of some, lewd or improper thought. That's not a very lofty level. That's to be expected by anybody. So why would they have succumbed? What terrible thought could they have had? So Manis Friedman suggests, Rabbi Friedman, beautiful answer. It wasn't like they were thinking some corrupt, some terrible, off-color joke. It wasn't what they were thinking of when they went to the. Nobody would think of that in the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. Just want to paint the scene. There are tens of thousands, or maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Temple Mountain area, all eyes on the Kohen Gadol. I mean, this is a moment of spiritual euphoria. No matter what you were doing the moment before, no matter what, everybody's lifted to this place. It's like the Shema Yisrael of Ne'ilah. Do you have to be a big tzaddik when you say the Shema Yisrael? You don't have to be carried by the moment. You can be thinking that about some dumb TV show you saw, some joke or some poor taste off color. No one is. It's Ne'ilah. This is more than Ne'ilah. So what could he possibly be thinking? Rabbi Friedman says, you know what the improper thought is? I've arrived. I've earned this to the dint of my payment or whatever. And what's improper about that? In the house and chamber of God, one is there by invitation, not by right. That's the violation. That's the abuse of the place. Now I want to add here.
But
Yeah?
it just strikes me as odd that you would get to that position and even deign to have that thought. I mean, I would think you would be in such a meditative state that you would be feeling so much in awe of the privilege
He was
of
Yes.
being there, not of the fact that you earned it or came to it by right.
It's both. It's wow. Like it's like to give an extreme example, kind of, you paid dearly on a vacation, and then you arrive there, Himalayas, whatever it is, and you're at awe and wonder. But the whole foundation is a deep satisfaction that I've invested, earned, and I've arrived. You're not thinking about that consciously, but it's certainly the context of your being there. And rightfully, no one handed this to you. So the contrary, your enjoyment there is because of the great effort you invested to get there. That's part of the awe and wonder of the place, as opposed to someone just, casually, inviting you. But the deep error there is that there's no room for that at all. It's by invitation. Now, that's why, friends, I think, when we go to the oil of a tzaddik, we knock on the door symbolically. Same idea. We don't waltz in. I'm here. This is a place of holiness, of sanctity, where God is revealed. I'm here because I'm invited. The tzaddik wants me to come and wants to bless me. I need to acknowledge that. I haven't earned it. I'm invited. And the same thing applies, friends, in relationships. As you know, husband and wife is a mirror of our relationship with God. And the Holy of Holies, the Zohar says, based on Scripture, is called God's bedroom. The Holy of Holies, Yom Kippur, is God's bedroom, the place where He and man, represented by the high priest, become one in the deepest way. And by the way, it tells you that bedrooms are off limits to everybody else. Your bedroom that you share with your husband is a sacred room. Children, strangers, even children, don't waltz in. So, yeah. Here's the point. It's saying, this applies to the guy. Intimacy is not a right. It's by invitation. It's by her rhythm or invitation, whatever stage in life she is. It's completely on her terms, not on his. That's what this is saying. It's my wife, I'm married, I paid, I did it. It's a privilege. It's a privilege. Privilege to be married, a privilege to serve, a privilege to be connected, and certainly a privilege to be one. That's the improper thought. I've arrived, I've earned it, I've achieved my goal. Not about your goal. It's about an invitation that you are responding to. Completely different relationship. Mind you, it's the job of the husband to see that the wife should invite him. Be romantic and seductive and so on. But the invitation, from him, from her. So that, getting back to our discussion, is kind of, we're trying to answer the question, why is it called parhedron? I mean, it's a ignoble description. What I'm looking for, it's a derogatory description. But upon reflection, these Kohanim, these people are vying for this. They want to be in the Holy of Holies, and knowing that they may lose their lives. How many people will do that? So it's a kind of a compliment. But the Rebbe is not satisfied with this. Because at the end of the day, the reality is, it's not a compliment. It's describing a turnover of high priests. And our original question stands, why are we using this term in the Holy Temple? It's used before Yom Kippur, and it was used by high priests who were righteous. So when I go next week much deeper into the subject, and at the end we'll have the answer to why the chamber is made of wood and must be. We already know that because longevity and long life, but covered. That's going to be the end. We'll have the answer to why it's covered. Have to come back.
Thank you.
But I think we learned something along the way. Yes, we did. Thank you all for listening.